The letter in Tommy McKinnon's trembling hands might as well have been a death sentence. Final notice, $3,847 due by week's end, or property will be seized. His weathered face told the story of a man who had run out of miracles. "Pa, what's wrong?" Annie asked, setting down the water bucket she'd been carrying from their struggling well. At 23, she had the calloused hands of someone who'd sacrificed her college dreams to keep her family afloat, but her brown eyes still held the intelligence that had once earned her a teaching scholarship. Through the kitchen window, Annie could see her world, her blind mother Mary sitting with the 4 younger girls, ages 4 to 12, all of them depending on the crumbling farm that was about to be ripped away from them. "We have 3 days," Tommy said, his voice hollow. 3 days to find nearly $4,000, or we lose everything. Annie felt her stomach drop. That amount represented 2 years of debt to Royce Henderson, the richest rancher in 3 counties, a man who owned half of Texas and could crush families like theirs without blinking. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached their modest homestead. Annie's heart clenched with dread as she recognized the gleaming black Cadillac that could only belong to one man. "He's coming," she whispered. Tommy's face went pale. "Stay inside, Annie. Whatever he says, whatever he wants." But Annie straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin with the dignity her mother had taught her. "No, if our family's about to lose everything, I want to face it head on." The most powerful man in 3 counties was about to step onto their porch, and Annie McKinnon had no idea that her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. Royce Henderson stepped out of his Cadillac like a king surveying his domain, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the Texas heat, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the poverty that surrounded the McKinnon homestead. At 60, he was a man who had built an empire through a combination of shrewd business sense and ruthless determination, and his presence commanded attention even in this humble setting. Annie watched from the kitchen window as her father straightened his shoulders and walked out to greet the most powerful man in 3 counties. Through the thin walls of their house, she could hear every word of their conversation, and what she heard made her blood run cold. "Tommy," Royce's voice carried the casual authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "I think you know why I'm here." "Mr. Henderson, sir," Tommy's voice was strained, "I was hoping we might discuss an extension. Maybe work out some kind of payment plan." Tommy," Royce interrupted, his tone almost paternal, "we've been down this road before. You're a good man, but good intentions don't pay debts." Annie pressed her ear closer to the window, her heart pounding as she listened to her father's desperate attempts to negotiate for their survival. But it was what happened next that changed everything. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" Royce asked, and before Tommy could respond, Annie was already moving toward the door, her mother's ingrained hospitality overriding her fear. She stepped onto the porch carrying a mason jar filled with their precious well water, her simple cotton dress and sun-kissed skin making her look like something from a painting of rural innocence. When she handed Royce the water, their eyes met for just a moment, and Annie saw something in his gaze that made her stomach churn. A calculating assessment that had nothing to do with their financial situation. "Thank you, miss," Royce said, his voice noticeably softer. "You have excellent manners." Annie nodded politely and turned to go back inside, but she could feel his eyes following her every movement. Something in the air had shifted, and she didn't like it. "Tommy," Royce continued after draining the glass, "I recognize a diamond when I see one." Tommy glanced toward the house where Annie had disappeared, confusion clouding his features. "Annie's a good girl, Mr. Henderson. Works harder than any 2 men I know." "Your girl seems to have well more than beauty," Royce pressed, his tone becoming more pointed. "I travel all over Texas for business, and I've never seen a young woman with such grace and kindness. I really do know how to recognize a diamond when I see one." The compliments sent warning bells clanging in Tommy's head. In their world, when powerful men started noticing poor men's daughters, it rarely ended well for anyone involved. "Mr. Henderson," Tommy said carefully, "I'm not sure what you're getting at." Royce set down the empty glass and looked Tommy directly in the eye. "Listen, Tommy, if you give me your daughter, we can forget about your debt." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face flushing with anger and disbelief. What kind of man do you think I am? He exploded. I would never sell my daughter. She's barely past 20, and you're old enough to be her grandfather. Royce held up his hands, laughing at the misunderstanding. Easy there, Tommy. I think you've got the wrong idea. I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about my youngest son, Chase. He's 27, a good man, but he has some challenges that make it difficult for him to find a wife among the society ladies. Tommy's anger subsided slightly, replaced by wariness. Everyone in the county knew about Chase Henderson, the son who had been injured in a riding accident years ago and now walked with a pronounced limp. The local gossips whispered that he was bitter and reclusive, that his disability had turned him into something of a hermit on his father's vast ranch. Your boy's a grown man, Tommy said slowly. Why doesn't he find his own wife? Because, Royce's voice carried a note of paternal pain. The girls from good families see the limp and decide they can do better. Chase has given up on the idea of marriage, but I haven't given up on seeing him happy. Your Annie, she seems like the kind of woman who might see past physical imperfections to the man underneath. Tommy shook his head vehemently. Annie's not for sale, Mr. Henderson. I'll find another way to pay what I owe. Royce studied Tommy's face for a long moment, then nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. I understand, Tommy. You're a good father. But think about it. I'll be staying at the Rustwood Ranch Hotel until the end of the week. If you change your mind, the offer stands. Your debt wiped clean, and your daughter married into one of the wealthiest families in Texas. As Royce's Cadillac disappeared in another cloud of dust, Tommy stood alone on his porch, feeling like a man drowning in an ocean of impossible choices. Inside the house, Annie pressed her back against the kitchen wall, her mind reeling from what she had overheard. The seed of an idea was beginning to form in her mind, an idea so dangerous and desperate that it terrified her even as it offered hope. But as she looked around at her struggling family, at her blind mother and her young sisters who deserved better than poverty and uncertainty, Annie began to wonder if sometimes the most unthinkable choices were the only ones that made sense. The dinner table that night was quieter than usual, the weight of unspoken truths hanging in the air like smoke from their meager fire. Tommy pushed his beans around his plate without eating, his mind clearly elsewhere, while Mary tried to maintain normalcy for the sake of the younger girls. Only Annie seemed to have any appetite, though it was false bravado designed to keep her sisters from sensing the family's desperation. Pa, Annie said quietly after the younger ones had been sent to bed, I heard what Mr. Henderson said today. Tommy's head snapped up, his face flushing with embarrassment and anger. Annie McKinnon, you know better than to eavesdrop on private conversations. I heard my name, she replied simply, meeting his gaze with steady brown eyes that held wisdom beyond her 23 years. I think that gives me the right to know what's being discussed. Mary reached across the table and found Annie's hand. What are you two talking about? Tommy sighed heavily and explained Royce Henderson's proposition, watching his wife's face cycle through the same emotions he had experienced. Shock, anger, and finally, a desperate calculation that broke his heart. You told him no, of course, Mary said, though her voice lacked conviction. Of course I did. Tommy's voice was firm, but Annie could see the doubt creeping into his eyes as he looked around their humble home, calculating how many days they had left before losing everything. Annie took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change her life forever. What if I want to accept? Absolutely not, Tommy said immediately. I won't have you sacrificing yourself for our mistakes. They're not your mistakes, Pa, Annie said gently. The drought, Mama's illness, the crop failures, none of that was your fault. But this could be a solution that saves our family. You don't understand what you're saying, sweetheart, Mary interjected, her sightless eyes bright with unshed tears. Marriage isn't something you enter into for financial reasons. It's for love, for partnership. And what if I never find love? Annie interrupted. What if I spend my whole life on this farm, watching it struggle, watching my sisters grow up without opportunities because we can never get ahead? At least this way, one of us has a chance at something better. Tommy leaned forward, his voice intense. Annie, you don't know anything about this Chase Henderson. The reason he can't find a wife among his own kind is probably because he's mean or cruel or maybe it's because rich girls are shallow and care more about appearances than character, Annie countered. You raised me to see the good in people, Pa. Why can't you trust me to make this decision for myself? The argument continued deep into the night, but Annie's mind was already made up. As she lay in bed listening to her younger sisters breathe softly beside her, she thought about the conversation she'd overheard earlier. Tommy's plan to try for a bank loan was doomed to failure. Everyone knew that Royce Henderson had enough influence to make sure no bank in 3 counties would loan money to someone who owed him a debt. When dawn broke gray and cloudy, promising another scorching day, Annie heard her father preparing for his trip to town. She dressed quickly and slipped out of the house, hiding in the back of their old wagon under a tarp as Tommy hitched up their ancient horse. The ride to town was bumpy and uncomfortable, but Annie's determination never wavered. When Tommy stopped at the bank, she waited until he disappeared inside, then slipped out of the wagon and made her way to the Rustwood Ranch Hotel, the finest establishment in their small town, and the only place wealthy enough to accommodate a man like Royce Henderson. The hotel lobby was more luxurious than anything Annie had ever seen, with polished wood floors, velvet furniture, and a crystal chandelier that caught the morning light streaming through tall windows. She felt completely out of place in her simple cotton dress and worn boots, but she straightened her shoulders and approached the front desk with all the dignity she could muster. I need to speak with Mr. Royce Henderson, she told the clerk, whose disdainful glance took in her obviously poor appearance. Tell him Annie McKinnon is here to see him. 20 minutes later, Annie sat across from Royce Henderson in the hotel's elegant parlor, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she delivered the speech she had rehearsed during the sleepless night. Mr. Henderson, she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing, I overheard your conversation with my father yesterday. I want you to know that I accept your offer. Royce leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with the same calculating gaze she remembered from the previous day. Your father was quite clear that he wouldn't allow such an arrangement. My father is a good man who wants to protect me, Annie replied. But I'm old enough to make my own decisions, and I've decided that marrying your son is the best choice for everyone involved. And why is that, Miss McKinnon? Annie lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. Because my family is going to lose everything if something doesn't change. Because my sisters deserve a chance to go to school and have opportunities one never had. And because maybe your son deserves a wife who wants to marry him for who he is, not what he has. Royce was quiet for a long moment, and Annie could see a flicker of respect in his eyes. You have courage, young lady, but I can't proceed without your father's blessing. That's not how honorable men conduct business. Annie felt her heart sink, but Royce held up a hand. However, I can promise you this, I'll speak with your father again. I'll make it clear that this was your idea, your choice. If he agrees to give his blessing, then my wife Margot and I will be happy to welcome you into our family. As Annie walked back toward the bank to meet her father, her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and hope. She had just committed to marrying a man she had never met, a man who might be cruel or bitter or worse. But she had also taken the first step towards saving her family from destitution. Sometimes, Annie reflected, love was not about passion or romance. Sometimes, love was about sacrifice, about putting the needs of others before your own dreams. And if that wasn't the kind of love that poets wrote about, it was still the kind of love that changed the world, one difficult choice at a time. Tommy's face went through a series of expressions when he found Annie waiting by their wagon outside the bank: confusion, realization, and finally, a mixture of pride and heartbreak that made her chest tighten with emotion. Annie, he said quietly, what have you done? What I had to do, Pa, she replied, taking his calloused hands in hers. The bank said no, didn't they? Tommy's silence was answer enough. Annie could see the defeat in his shoulders, the weight of a man who had run out of options and was facing the destruction of everything he had worked for. Mr. Henderson will be coming to the house this evening, Annie continued gently. He wants to discuss the arrangement with your blessing. And if I refuse to give it? Annie looked at her father with eyes that held a strength he had never seen before. Then I'll respect your decision, Pa. But I'll also watch our family lose everything, and I'll know that I could have prevented it. The ride home was silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived at the house, Annie went immediately to help her mother with the younger girls while Tommy sat on the porch, staring out at the land that had been his life's work. When Royce Henderson's Cadillac appeared on the horizon that evening, the entire McKinnon family was waiting. Annie had bathed and put on her best dress, a simple blue cotton that her mother had made for church services. She had braided her long brown hair and pinched her cheeks for color, wanting to look as presentable as possible for what might be the most important conversation of her life. Royce arrived with his wife Margot, an elegant woman in her mid-50s whose kind eyes and gentle manner immediately put Annie at ease. While Tommy and Royce discussed the practical aspects of the arrangement on the porch, Margot sat with Annie and Mary in the kitchen, asking gentle questions about Annie's interests and dreams. "My dear," Margot said softly, "I want you to understand that this doesn't have to be a loveless arrangement. Chase is a good man, wounded, perhaps, and certainly stubborn, but he has a kind heart underneath all that defensive armor." "What happened to him?" Annie asked, curiosity overcoming her nervousness. Margot's expression grew sad. "A riding accident when he was 19. A stallion threw him, and he landed badly. The doctors said he was lucky to walk at all, but the injury left him with a permanent limp. Worse than the physical damage, though, was what it did to his confidence. He was always the athletic one, the one who rode like he was born in the saddle. After the accident, he became different, angry, withdrawn. And he's never married? He's convinced himself that no woman could love a broken man," Margot said with obvious frustration. "He's had opportunities, there have been women who were interested, but he drives them away before they can get close enough to hurt him." Annie absorbed this information, beginning to form a picture of the man she was agreeing to marry. A hurt soul who had built walls around himself, convinced that his physical imperfection made him unworthy of love. In some ways, she thought, they might understand each other better than anyone expected. On the porch, the conversation between Tommy and Royce had reached its conclusion. Tommy came inside, his face grave but resolute. "Annie," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "if this is truly what you want, if you're certain you can be happy in this arrangement, then you have my blessing." Annie felt tears prick her eyes as she embraced her father. "Thank you, Pa. But," Tommy continued, holding her at arm's length, "I want your promise that if you're ever unhappy, ever mistreated in any way, you'll come home immediately. Family is family, and no debt is worth your suffering." "I promise," Annie whispered. 3 days later, Annie stood in the yard of her childhood home with a single carpet bag containing her few possessions. Her sisters clung to her, tears streaming down their faces, while Mary held her eldest daughter with a grip that spoke of maternal fear and love in equal measure. "Write to us," Mary whispered. "Every week. I want to know that you're well and happy." "I will, Mama," Annie promised, though her own voice was shaking with emotion. As Royce's Cadillac pulled away from the McKinnon homestead, Annie turned in her seat to watch her family and her childhood home disappear in the distance. She was traveling toward a future that was completely unknown, toward a marriage with a man she had never met, toward a life that was as terrifying as it was hopeful. But she was also traveling toward the knowledge that her family's debt had been forgiven, that her sisters would have food on the table and a roof over their heads, that her mother would receive the medical care she needed. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Annie faced them with the quiet strength of a woman who had chosen love over fear, sacrifice over self-preservation. The Henderson Ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began to set, its sprawling buildings and endless pastures a testament to generations of wealth and success. Somewhere in that vast estate was the man who would become her husband, the wounded soul she had agreed to spend her life with. Annie straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, ready to meet whatever destiny awaited her with courage and grace. After all, she thought with a small smile, she was Tommy McKinnon's daughter, and McKinnons didn't back down from a challenge, no matter how daunting it might seem. The Henderson Ranch was unlike anything Annie had ever imagined. Sprawling across thousands of acres, it featured a main house that looked more like a mansion from her schoolbooks, with white columns, wraparound porches, and windows that glowed warmly in the evening light. Outbuildings dotted the landscape, barns, stables, worker housing, creating what amounted to a small town dedicated to the business of raising cattle and horses. As their car approached the main house, Annie caught sight of a figure on the front porch, partially hidden in the shadows cast by the setting sun. Even from a distance, she could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, and when he shifted his weight, the slight awkwardness of his movement confirmed what she already knew. This was Chase Henderson, the man she had agreed to marry. Margot reached over and squeezed Annie's hand. "Remember, dear, first impressions aren't always accurate. Give him time to show you who he really is." The car stopped in front of the house, and Royce immediately got out to help Annie with her modest bag. As they approached the porch, Annie got her first clear look at her intended husband, and what she saw took her breath away. Chase Henderson was nothing like she had expected. Despite his father's talk of finding a wife for a broken man, the man standing before her was devastatingly handsome. His dark hair caught the porch light, his green eyes were intelligent and intense, and his strong jaw was set in an expression of barely controlled anger. The limp that Margot had described was noticeable but hardly disfiguring. If anything, it added a certain gravity to his bearing. "Chase," Royce said with forced cheerfulness, "I'd like you to meet Annie McKinnon." Annie stepped forward, extending her hand with the same polite confidence she had shown at the hotel. "Mr. Henderson, it's a pleasure to meet you." Chase stared at her offered hand for a long moment before taking it briefly, his touch warm but impersonal. "Miss McKinnon," he said, his voice carrying a bitter edge that made Annie's heart sink. "I suppose my father has explained the arrangement." "He has," Annie replied calmly, though inside she was reeling from the hostility in his tone. "And you're comfortable with the idea of marrying a cripple for money?" The cruel words hung in the air like a slap. Annie felt Margot stiffen beside her and saw Royce's face flush with anger, but she kept her own expression steady. "I'm comfortable with the idea of marrying a good man who needs a partner," she replied quietly. "As for the rest, I think that says more about your opinion of yourself than it does about mine." Chase's eyes widened slightly, clearly not expecting such a direct response. For a moment, the anger in his expression flickered, replaced by something that might have been surprise or even respect. "Dinner will be ready in an hour," Margot interjected smoothly, shooting her son a warning look. "Annie, let me show you to your room so you can freshen up." As they moved into the house, Annie caught a glimpse of Chase's face and saw something that broke her heart. Beneath the anger and bitterness was a profound sadness, the look of a man who had convinced himself he was unworthy of love. The guest room Margot showed her to was larger than the entire bedroom Annie had shared with her sisters, with its own private bathroom and windows that looked out over the rolling pastures. After Margot left her alone to settle in, Annie sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. She had expected to marry a bitter invalid and instead found herself facing a man whose beauty was only matched by his pain. She had expected grateful acceptance and instead been met with hostility and suspicion. Nothing about this situation was going to be as simple as she had hoped. Dinner was a tense affair, with Royce and Margot carrying most of the conversation while Chase ate in sullen silence and Annie tried to navigate the unfamiliar territory of formal dining. She had never seen so many forks or eaten from such fine china, but she watched the others carefully and managed to avoid any major social blunders. "Annie," Margot said warmly, "your father mentioned that you had to leave school to help with the farm. What were you studying?" "I was hoping to become a teacher," Annie replied, grateful for a neutral topic. "I love working with children, helping them discover new ideas." "That's wonderful," Margot continued. "We have a small schoolhouse here on the ranch for the workers' children. Perhaps you might be interested in helping out there." Annie's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "I would love that." For the first time since they'd met, Chase looked directly at her, his expression unreadable. "My mother believes in finding useful occupations for everyone," he said, his tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent of something Annie couldn't identify. "I believe in using the gifts God gave us," Annie replied simply. "Everyone has something valuable to contribute." After dinner, Royce and Margot made their excuses and retired early, clearly wanting to give Annie and Chase time alone to get acquainted. The two of them sat in the large living room, the silence stretching awkwardly between them until Chase finally spoke. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said bluntly. "I know why you're here. My father paid your family's debts, and in exchange, you agreed to marry the family disappointment. We can make this work without any romantic nonsense." Annie studied his face, seeing the walls he had built around himself as clearly as if they were made of stone. "Is that what you think you are? A disappointment?" "I think I'm a realist," Chase replied harshly. "I know what I am and what I'm not. And I'm not the kind of man that women dream of marrying." Annie was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "You're right that I came here because of my family's situation. I won't lie about that. But you're wrong about everything else." "Am I?" "Yes," she said firmly. "You're wrong if you think I see you as damaged goods. You're wrong if you think your worth is determined by how perfectly you can walk. And you're wrong if you think this has to be a loveless arrangement." Chase's expression shifted, confusion replacing some of the anger. "You don't know me." "No," Annie agreed. "But I'd like to. If you'll let me." For just a moment, the walls came down, and Annie saw a glimpse of the man Chase might have been before pain and bitterness changed him, vulnerable, hopeful, and desperately lonely. Then the barriers slammed back into place, and he stood up abruptly. "I'm going to bed," he announced. "Good night, Miss McKinnon." As Annie watched him walk away, favoring his injured leg but moving with dignity and strength, she felt her heart go out to him. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin the delicate work of showing Chase Henderson that sometimes the most beautiful souls came in packages that the world had labeled as broken. She had come here to save her family, but perhaps, if she was very lucky and very patient, she might also save the wounded man who would become her husband. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Annie had found her rhythm on the Henderson ranch. She taught the workers' children each morning, helped Margot with household management, and had earned the respect of everyone on the property, everyone except the man she was supposed to marry. Chase watched her from a distance like a hawk studying prey, his expression unreadable as she effortlessly integrated herself into their world. But something was changing. Annie caught him staring sometimes, saw the way his jaw tightened when other ranch hands spoke to her with obvious admiration. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday when Chase was working with Thunder, the stallion that had thrown him years ago. Annie had been hanging laundry nearby when she heard the commotion. The horse had reared and Chase, caught off balance, had fallen hard. Without thinking, Annie vaulted the fence and approached the agitated stallion with calm confidence. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice soothing. "Nobody's going to hurt you." Within minutes, she had the horse calm enough for the ranch hands to help Chase to his feet. He stared at her in amazement, embarrassment, and something else warring in his expression. "You could have been killed," he said roughly. "So could you," Annie replied, studying his face for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "My pride more than anything else," Chase admitted, surprising them both with his honesty. That evening he found her on the front porch, mending one of his father's shirts. "I wanted to thank you," he said, settling beside her. "For today." "You don't need to thank me. We're going to be family." "Is that what we are?" Chase asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Annie set down her sewing and turned to face him. "I don't know what we are yet, but I know what we could be if we both wanted it." The air between them crackled with unspoken possibilities. Chase reached out and touched her hand, the contact sending electricity up her arm. "Annie," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes. I'm afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that if I let myself care about you, you'll realize you deserve better than a broken man." Annie's heart clenched at the vulnerability in his confession. "What if I told you that I don't see you as broken? What if I told you that every day I spend here, I fall a little more in love with the man you really are?" Chase's breath caught. Slowly, tentatively, he cupped her face in his hands. "Annie, kiss me," she whispered. "Please." When their lips met, it was like lightning striking. All the careful distance they'd maintained, all the polite conversations and proper behavior, melted away in an instant. Chase kissed her with weeks of pent-up longing, and Annie responded with a passion that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "That wasn't supposed to happen," Chase said, though he made no move to let her go. Maybe not, Annie agreed, but I'm glad it did. 2 days later, Chase was waiting for her after her morning teaching session, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. I thought maybe you'd like to see more of the ranch, he said, suddenly shy. If you're not too busy. Annie's smile could have lit up the entire state of Texas. I'd love that. They spent the day riding across the vast Henderson property, and for the first time since arriving, Annie felt truly happy. Not the grim satisfaction of duty fulfilled, but pure joy. As they sat by an old cabin ruins sharing lunch, Chase turned to her with serious eyes. Annie, I need you to know something. When my father first told me about this arrangement, I was angry. But these past weeks, getting to know you... He paused, struggling with the words. You're not here out of desperation. You're here out of love for your family. And maybe if I'm very lucky, you might find some love for me too. Annie felt tears prick her eyes. Chase Henderson, I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement the day I watched you work with Thunder. I saw who you really are underneath all that protective anger. Chase reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. This was my grandmother's ring, he said, hands trembling. I want to ask you properly. Annie McKinnon, will you marry me? Not because our families made a deal, but because I love you and I want you to be my wife. Through her tears, Annie nodded. Yes, because I love you too. As Chase slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her with tender passion, Annie felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Chase Henderson not because a contract demanded it, but because her heart demanded it. The words hung between them like a bridge, waiting to see if Chase would dare to cross it. For a moment, his hand tightened around hers, and Annie thought she saw hope flicker in his green eyes like candlelight in a window. Then, slowly, deliberately, Chase lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Annie McKinnon, he said, his voice rough with emotion, you are the most extraordinary woman I've ever known. The next morning, Chase was waiting for Annie when she came down for breakfast, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked from the fields. I thought, he said, suddenly shy, maybe you'd like to see more of the ranch today. If you're not too busy with the school. Annie's smile could have lit up the entire state of Texas. I'd love that. They spent the day riding across the vast Henderson property, Chase on a gentle mare and Annie on a spirited gelding that reminded her of the horses she had loved back home. Chase showed her hidden valleys where bluebonnets carpeted the ground, streams where cattle came to drink, and the spot where his grandparents had first built their cabin when they'd claimed this land 60 years ago. As they sat by the old cabin ruins, sharing a simple lunch that the cook had packed for them, Annie felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving school, pure happiness. Not the grim satisfaction of duty fulfilled or the relief of crisis averted, but the bubbling joy of being exactly where she belonged with exactly the right person. Annie, Chase said suddenly, his voice serious. I need you to know something. She turned to face him, noting the nervous tension in his shoulders. When my father first told me about this arrangement, I was angry. Not just at him, but at you, at the whole situation. I thought. He paused, struggling with the words. I thought you were either desperate enough to marry anyone with money or pitying enough to take on a charity case. Annie remained silent, letting him work through whatever he needed to say. But these past weeks, watching you, getting to know you... Chase turned to look at her directly. Annie, you're not here out of desperation or pity. You're here out of love. Love for your family, love for doing what's right. And maybe if I'm very lucky, you might find some love for me too. Annie felt tears prick her eyes at the vulnerability in his voice. Chase Henderson, she said softly, I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement the day I watched you work with Thunder. I saw how gentle you were with him, how patient, even though he had hurt you. I saw the man you really are underneath all that protective anger. And what kind of man is that? The kind I want to spend my life with, Annie replied without hesitation. Chase reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. This was my grandmother's ring, he said, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold band set with a modest but beautiful diamond. I know we're supposed to be married anyway because of the arrangement, but I want to ask you properly. Annie McKinnon, will you marry me? Not because our families made a deal, but because I love you and I want you to be my wife." Annie's tears spilled over as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Chase slipped the ring onto her finger with infinite care, then cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with all the tenderness and passion of a man who had found something he thought was lost forever. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. "I love you too," Annie whispered against his lips. "I love you so much it scares me." "Then we'll be scared together," Chase replied, pulling her close. "And maybe, if we're very brave, we'll build something beautiful out of this frightened love." As they rode back toward the main house, Annie's left hand secure on the reins and Chase's grandmother's ring catching the afternoon sunlight, Annie felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. She had come to the Henderson Ranch as a sacrifice, a daughter sold to pay her family's debts. But somewhere along the way, she had found something infinitely more valuable than financial security. She had found love, real, honest, transformative love that saw past imperfections to the souls beneath. And tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Chase Henderson not because a contract demanded it, but because her heart demanded it. 2 days before their planned wedding, Tommy McKinnon arrived at the Henderson Ranch in his old wagon, dressed in his Sunday best and carrying a small wooden box that contained Annie's mother's pearl necklace, the only valuable thing the family owned that hadn't been sold or lost to debt. Annie flew into her father's arms the moment she saw him, tears of joy streaming down her face. "I can't believe you're here. Wouldn't miss my eldest daughter's wedding for the world," Tommy said, holding her tight. "Besides, your mama would never forgive me if I didn't give you her pearls to wear." Chase watched the reunion from the porch, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Over the past weeks, he had grown to understand just how much Annie's family meant to her, how the letters she wrote and received each week were lifelines that kept her connected to the people she loved most in the world. "Mr. McKinnon," Chase said, walking over to shake Tommy's hand. "Welcome to our home. I hope you'll stay for a few days. Annie would love to spend more time with you before the wedding." Tommy studied the young man who was about to become his son-in-law, noting the obvious love in his eyes when he looked at Annie and the protective way he stayed close to her side. "I'd be honored to, son." That evening, the three of them sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tommy regaled them with stories from home, how Mary's vision had improved slightly with new medicine, how the younger girls were excelling in their studies, how the farm was finally beginning to recover under the management of a neighbor who worked it in exchange for a share of the profits. "The debt being forgiven changed everything," Tommy said quietly. "We're not rich, but we're stable. Secure. The girls have a future now, thanks to Annie's sacrifice." Chase glanced at Annie, who was listening with a peaceful expression. "It wasn't a sacrifice, Pa," she said gently. "It was the best decision I ever made." "Even so," Tommy continued, "I want you to know how proud I am of you, sweetheart. Leaving everything familiar to help your family, making a life with someone you'd never met, that takes more courage than most people have." Chase listened to this exchange with growing warmth in his chest. This was what real love looked like, not the passionate declaration of poetry or novels, but the quiet, steady decision to put others' needs before your own. Annie had shown that kind of love to her family, and over the past weeks, she had shown it to him as well. The next morning, while Annie was in town with Margot choosing last-minute flowers for the wedding, Tommy and Chase worked together repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. As they worked, Tommy shared stories about Annie's childhood, her determination to teach herself to read before starting school, her patience with her younger sisters, her tears when she'd had to leave college. "She always put family first," Tommy said, hammering a fence post into place. Even as a little girl, if one of her sisters was hurt or scared, Annie would drop whatever she was doing to help. Breaking that girl's heart would be like kicking a puppy, son. "I hope you understand that." "I do, sir," Chase replied seriously. "And I hope you understand that hurting Annie would hurt me just as much. She's become the center of my world." Tommy nodded, satisfied with the sincerity in the young man's voice. "Good. That's what I wanted to hear." But as they worked, their conversation drifted to practical matters: the ranch's operations, the cattle market, the challenges of farming in Texas's unpredictable climate. Without thinking, Tommy mentioned the original debt that had brought Annie to the ranch, discussing it as a solved problem rather than a secret to be kept. Neither man noticed Chase's sudden stillness, the way his hammer paused mid-swing as Tommy's words registered in his mind. The debt forgiveness really was a miracle, Tommy continued, oblivious to the storm brewing in his future son-in-law. $3,847 might not sound like much to folks like you, but to us it was everything. Annie knew that when she agreed to come here. Chase felt the world tilt around him as the full implications of what Tommy had said sank in. Annie had known about the debt. She had known that her marriage was literally purchasing her family's financial freedom. Everything she had told him about love, about choosing him for himself rather than circumstances, all of it had been built on a foundation of financial necessity that she had deliberately concealed. "Excuse me," Chase said abruptly, setting down his hammer with hands that shook with suppressed emotion. I'll be right back." Tommy watched in confusion as Chase walked rapidly toward the house, his limp more pronounced as anger and hurt disrupted his usual careful control. Chase found Annie in the garden behind the house, humming softly as she cut roses for the dining room table. She looked up with a radiant smile when she heard his footsteps, but the expression died when she saw his face. "Chase? What's wrong?" "I had an interesting conversation with your father," Chase said, his voice dangerously quiet, "about debts and arrangements, and the real reason you're here." Annie felt the blood drain from her face as understanding dawned. "Chase, let me explain." "Explain what?" Chase's voice rose as weeks of buried insecurity and pain erupted like a dam bursting. "Explain how you've been lying to me for weeks? Explain how everything you said about love and choice was just a performance to keep your family's benefactor happy." "That's not true," Annie protested, dropping her basket of roses as she reached toward him. "Yes, I knew about the debt, but that's not why I stayed. That's not why I fell in love with you. Isn't it?" Chase's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Your family gets their debts forgiven, they get to keep their land, your sisters get to go to school, and all it costs is poor Annie sacrificing herself to marry the crippled son of the family that owns half of Texas." "Don't you dare," Annie said, her own temper finally flaring. "Don't you dare reduce what we have to money and pity. You know me better than that." "Do I?" Chase shot back. "Because the woman I thought I knew was honest. The woman I thought I knew chose to be here because she wanted to be, not because her family's survival depended on it." Annie felt tears streaming down her face, but her voice remained strong. "I am here because I want to be. Yes, I came because of my family's situation, but I stayed because of you. I fell in love with you because of who you are, not what you can provide." Chase's eyes darkened as he looked at her. "I thought you were different, Annie. I thought you actually cared about me, not what I could provide for your family." "I am different," Annie shot back, her composure finally cracking. "I do care about you. Yes, I came here because of my family's debt, but I fell in love with you because of who you are. How can you not see that after everything we've shared? How convenient that loving me also happens to solve all your family's problems," Chase said, the words cutting like a blade. Annie stared at him as if he'd slapped her. "If that's what you really think of me," she said quietly, her voice breaking, "then you never knew me at all." Annie looked at him for one long moment, memorizing his face, trying to see past the anger to the fear underneath. "I love you, Chase Henderson," she said simply. "I love you enough to walk away if that's what you really want. But don't pretend this is about honesty or money or arrangements. This is about you being so afraid of being hurt that you'd rather destroy something beautiful than risk believing in it." Without another word, Annie turned and walked toward the house, leaving Chase alone in the garden with the scattered roses and the bitter taste of his own self-destruction. Annie's departure from the Henderson ranch was as quiet as her arrival had been momentous. She packed her few belongings in the same carpetbag she had brought, leaving behind the beautiful dresses Margot had bought for her and the books Chase had given her to read. The only thing she kept was his grandmother's ring, which she placed in a small envelope along with a letter she had written in the sleepless hours before dawn. Margot found her in the kitchen as the sun was rising, her eyes red from crying but her resolve unshaken. "Annie dear," Margot said softly, "surely this can be worked out." Chase was angry and hurt, but he was also right, Annie interrupted gently. "I should have told him about the debt from the beginning. I let him believe something that wasn't entirely true, and now he can't trust me." "You let him believe you cared for him," Margot protested. "That was true, wasn't it?" "It was the truest thing I've ever felt," Annie replied, her voice breaking slightly. "But that doesn't matter now. He's convinced himself that I was just playing a role, and maybe it's better this way. Maybe he deserves someone who doesn't come with complications." Tommy drove Annie home in uncomfortable silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. He blamed himself for the disaster. If he hadn't mentioned the debt, if he had been more careful with his words, his daughter would be preparing for her wedding instead of returning home with a broken heart. The McKinnon homestead looked exactly the same as when Annie had left it 2 months ago, but everything felt different now. Her sisters gathered around her with excitement, eager to hear about her adventures at the Grand Ranch, but Annie's forced smiles and carefully edited stories couldn't hide the pain in her eyes. Mary, with the intuition that blindness had sharpened, pulled Annie aside that first evening. "What happened, my darling?" she asked, taking her daughter's hands in her own. "And don't tell me nothing, I can hear heartbreak in your voice." Annie collapsed into her mother's arms then, sobbing out the whole story, the growing love, the proposal, the terrible argument that had destroyed everything. Mary held her daughter and let her cry, understanding that sometimes the heart needed to pour out its pain before it could begin to heal. "Do you love him?" Mary asked when Annie's tears had finally subsided. "More than I thought possible," Annie whispered. "And does he love you? I thought he did. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe what I mistook for love was just gratitude or loneliness or—" "Annie McKinnon," Mary said firmly, "I raised you to be many things, but foolish wasn't one of them. If you saw love in that man's eyes, then love is what was there. Fear makes people do stupid things, sweetheart. It makes them push away the very things they want most." Back at the Henderson Ranch, Chase was discovering the truth of his mother's words. The house felt empty without Annie's presence, her laughter, her gentle singing as she worked in the garden. He found himself looking for her everywhere, expecting to see her in the schoolhouse with the children, in the kitchen helping with meals, on the front porch with her mending in the evenings. Margot and Royce tried to talk to him, to make him see reason, but Chase had retreated into the bitter fortress of his own making. He threw himself into ranch work with a desperation that worried everyone around him, pushing himself and his bad leg to the point of exhaustion in an effort to outrun the regret that followed him like a shadow. The envelope Annie had left for him sat unopened on his dresser for a week before he finally found the courage to read it. Her letter was brief but devastating in its simplicity. "My dearest Chase, I'm returning your grandmother's ring because it was meant for someone who could love you without complications. You deserve a wife who comes to you freely, without the weight of family obligations or financial necessity. I want you to know that every word I spoke about love was true. What I felt for you had nothing to do with debts or arrangements and everything to do with the man you showed me yourself to be, kind, strong, wounded but not broken, capable of such tenderness that it took my breath away. I hope someday you'll find someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved, without the shadows of doubt that my circumstances cast over us. Be happy, Chase. You deserve every beautiful thing this world has to offer. All my love, Annie." Chase read the letter until he had memorized every word, until the paper was worn soft from his handling. The ring sat beside it, catching the light from his window and reminding him of the moment he had slipped it onto Annie's finger, of the joy in her eyes when she had said yes to spending her life with him. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. The wedding that should have happened came and went, marked only by the flowers Margot had ordered that now wilted in vases throughout the house. Chase grew thinner, more haggard, driving himself relentlessly during the day and lying awake at night staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of his time with Annie. It was Thunder, the stallion that had brought them together, who finally broke through Chase's stubborn pride. Chase was working with the horse one evening when Thunder suddenly reared and fought against the lead rope, his wild eyes fixed on something beyond the corral fence. Chase turned to see what had spooked the animal and felt his heart stop. For just a moment, in the gathering dusk, he thought he saw Annie walking toward them across the pasture. But it was only Sarah, one of the ranch hand's daughters, her brown hair and slender build similar enough to create the cruel illusion. The realization that he was hallucinating, that his need for Annie had become so desperate that his mind was conjuring her presence, finally shattered the walls of denial he had built around himself. He loved her. He had loved her completely, unconditionally, and instead of treasuring that love, he had destroyed it with his own fear and pride. Annie had come to him as part of an arrangement, yes, but she had stayed because of love, and he had been too damaged, too afraid to believe in something so beautiful. That night, Chase sat down and wrote his own letter, pouring out his heart and his regrets onto paper. But when morning came, he realized that words weren't enough. If he wanted Annie back, and he wanted her more than he wanted his next breath, he would have to prove to her that he had learned to choose love over fear. He would have to go to her, humble himself, and pray that the woman who had shown him such grace would find it in her heart to forgive the man who had been too afraid to believe in miracles. The storm that rolled across Texas on that fateful Thursday was the kind that made sensible people bar their doors and wait for it to pass. The sky had been building toward violence all day, dark clouds gathering like an army preparing for battle, the air growing thick and oppressive with the promise of rain. Annie stood at her bedroom window, watching the approaching storm with a mixture of appreciation and melancholy. 3 weeks had passed since her return home, and while the sharp edge of her heartbreak had dulled to a persistent ache, she still found herself thinking about Chase at unexpected moments, wondering what he was doing, whether he missed her, whether he had found peace in his solitary life. Her sisters had tried their best to cheer her up, regaling her with stories of their improved circumstances, their new opportunities, the security that her sacrifice had brought to their family. But even their joy couldn't completely fill the hole that Chase's love had torn in her heart when it was ripped away. The first drops of rain began to fall as Annie helped her mother prepare dinner, fat droplets that splattered against the windows like tears. Within minutes, the gentle patter had become a deluge, the kind of Texas downpour that could flood roads and turn peaceful streams into raging torrents. "Mercy," Mary said, listening to the thunder that shook their small house. "I hope anyone caught out in this has sense enough to find shelter." Annie was setting the table when she heard it, the sound of hoofbeats approaching their house through the storm. She looked up sharply, her heart beginning to race with a hope she didn't dare acknowledge. Who would be riding in weather like this? What kind of desperate urgency would drive someone to brave the storm? She moved to the window and wiped away the condensation with her sleeve, peering out into the driving rain. At first, she could see nothing but gray sheets of water and the blurred outlines of their familiar landscape. Then, like a vision emerging from a dream, she saw him. Chase Henderson sat on his horse in the middle of their yard, completely soaked to the skin, his dark hair plastered to his head and his clothes clinging to his body. He wasn't moving toward the house or seeking shelter. He was simply sitting there in the storm, as if he was trying to gather the courage for whatever came next. Annie's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she wondered if she was hallucinating, if her longing for him had finally conjured his presence from nothing but rain and wishful thinking. But then he dismounted, favoring his bad leg as he always did, and she knew he was real. Without conscious thought, Annie ran for the door, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She burst onto the porch just as Chase reached the bottom step, and for a moment they stood frozen, staring at each other through the curtain of rain. He looked terrible, thinner than when she'd left, with dark circles under his eyes and a gauntness to his features that spoke of sleepless nights and barely touched meals. But his green eyes held something she had never seen there before, a desperate vulnerability that made her want to cry. "Chase," she breathed, her voice barely audible over the storm. "What are you doing here?" Instead of answering, Chase slowly, painfully, dropped to one knee in the mud and rain of her family's yard. The gesture was so unexpected, so dramatic and romantic and utterly unlike the controlled man she had known, that Annie felt tears spring to her eyes. "I came to grovel," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm. "I came to beg your forgiveness for being the biggest fool in Texas. I came to tell you that I love you, Annie McKinnon, and that I don't care about debts or arrangements or anything else except the fact that I can't breathe without you." Annie felt her resolve crumble as she looked down at him, this proud, stubborn man who had swallowed his pride enough to kneel in the mud for her. But she had to be sure, had to know that he truly understood what he was asking. "Chase, get up," she said, stepping off the porch into the rain. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted, staying on his knee despite the mud soaking through his pants. "I need to do this right. I need to ask you properly, the way I should have from the beginning." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the small velvet box containing his grandmother's ring, the same ring Annie had returned with her letter. "Annie McKinnon," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I don't care why you came to our ranch. I don't care about your family's debt or my father's arrangements or anything that happened before the moment I fell in love with you." Annie sank to her knees in front of him, not caring about her dress or the rain or anything except the man she loved finally understanding what really mattered. "I was a fool," Chase continued, his hands trembling as he held the ring between them. "I was so afraid of being hurt that I threw away the most precious thing I'd ever been given. I threw away your love, and I've regretted it every moment since." "Chase," Annie started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said. "I need you to know that I believe you. I believe that you loved me, that what we had was real. And I need you to know that I love you, not because you're convenient or grateful or anything else except that you're Annie, and you're everything good and brave and beautiful in this world." He opened the ring box with hands that shook from more than just the cold rain. "Will you marry me, Annie? Not because anyone says you should, not because of any arrangement or debt, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of the love you showed me." Annie looked into his eyes, those beautiful green eyes that had haunted her dreams, and saw the truth there. Not the bitter suspicion that had driven her away, but the love that had grown between them despite every obstacle, every doubt, every fear. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, laughing through her tears, "Yes, Chase Henderson, I'll marry you. I'll marry you because I love you, because I never stopped loving you, because you're worth fighting for even when you don't believe it yourself." Chase slipped the ring onto her finger with infinite care, and then they were kissing in the rain, holding each other as if they would never let go again. The storm raged around them, but they were safe in each other's arms, finally home. "I'm sorry," Chase murmured against her lips. "I'm so sorry I hurt you, so sorry I didn't believe." "Hush," Annie said, pressing her fingers to his mouth. "We're here now. That's all that matters." From the porch of the McKinnon house, Tommy and Mary and the 4 younger girls watched the reunion with tears of joy streaming down their faces. Love had conquered fear, trust had overcome doubt, and the daughter they had thought lost to heartbreak was smiling again. 1 month later, Annie McKinnon became Mrs. Chase Henderson in a simple ceremony at the small church where she had been baptized as a child. She wore her mother's pearls and a dress that Margot had lovingly sewn by hand, and when she walked down the aisle toward the man who was waiting for her with tears in his eyes, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something miraculous. Not the miracle of wealth rescuing poverty, or convenience masquerading as love, but the real miracle of 2 wounded souls finding healing in each other, of love that was strong enough to survive doubt and fear and the complications that life insisted on throwing in its path. As Chase and Annie spoke their vows, words they had written themselves, words that spoke of choice and commitment and the decision to love each other through whatever storms might come, the entire congregation understood that some love stories begin with business arrangements but end with something far more valuable than money could ever buy. They end with hope, with healing, and with the quiet certainty that love, real love, can indeed conquer all. 5 years later, Annie Henderson stood in the kitchen of their own home, a beautiful house that Chase had built for her on a hill overlooking the main Henderson ranch. In her arms, she held their 2-year-old son, Thomas, named for her father, while their 4-year-old daughter, Mary, named for Annie's mother, played at her feet with a collection of wooden horses that Chase had carved by hand. Through the window, she could see Chase working with a group of students in the riding arena they had built together. The Henderson Ranch Therapeutic Writing Program had become his passion project, a place where children and adults with disabilities could experience the freedom and confidence that came from working with horses. "Look, Mama," Mary said, pointing excitedly toward the arena. "Daddy's teaching Jimmy to ride." Annie smiled as she watched her husband patiently guide a young boy with cerebral palsy through his first solo ride. Chase's own limp had never fully healed, but it had given him a unique understanding of what it meant to overcome physical challenges. The children he worked with adored him, drawn to his quiet strength and his complete absence of pity. The little schoolhouse where Annie had first taught the ranch workers' children had been expanded into a full school that served families from 3 counties, providing education to children whose parents might not otherwise have been able to afford it. Annie served as the principal now, using the teaching degree she had finally completed through correspondence courses. "Mrs. Henderson," came a voice from the doorway, and Annie turned to see Sarah, her youngest sister, now 18 and serving as Annie's assistant at the school. "The new students have arrived for the summer program." Annie handed Thomas to his aunt and smoothed her skirts. "Wonderful. Are they settled in the dormitory?" "Yes, ma'am." "And Mrs. Henderson?" Sarah's eyes twinkled with mischief. "There's a telegram for you from Emma. She says the medical school has accepted her application." Annie's face lit up with joy. Emma, now 24, would be the first McKinnon woman to become a doctor, her education funded by the scholarship program that Annie and Chase had established in honor of Mary McKinnon's strength and sacrifice. As Annie walked toward the school to greet the new students, she reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. She had come to the Henderson Ranch as a poor farmer's daughter, selling herself to save her family. But she had found something infinitely more valuable than financial security. She had found love, not just romantic love, though her marriage to Chase grew stronger and more joyful with each passing year, but the love that came from using your gifts to serve others, from building something meaningful with your life, from creating a legacy that would outlast your own brief time on Earth. That evening, as they always did, Annie and Chase sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The children were asleep, the students were settled in their dormitories, and the ranch was quiet except for the gentle lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. "Do you ever regret it?" Chase asked, taking her hand in his. It was a question he had asked her many times over the years, always needing reassurance that she had chosen their life freely, without coercion or regret. "Only one thing," Annie replied, as she always did. "What's that?" Annie smiled and leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of the man who had become her anchor, her partner, her greatest love. "I regret that it took us so long to trust what we had. I regret the time we lost to fear and doubt." Chase pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "But we found our way back to each other." "Yes," Annie said softly, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "We did." In the distance, thunder grazed peacefully in the pasture, his wild spirit finally gentled by age and trust. Like his master, the stallion had learned that sometimes the most beautiful transformations came not from breaking but from healing, not from conquest but from love. And in the small farmhouse where Annie had grown up, Tommy and Mary McKinnon sat on their own porch, reading letters from their daughters, all 5 of them now successful, educated, and happy. The debt that had once threatened to destroy their family had become the catalyst for blessings they could never have imagined. Some stories, Annie thought as she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, begin with endings, with loss and desperation and impossible choices. But the very best stories, the ones worth telling and retelling, find a way to transform those endings into beginnings, those sacrifices into gifts, those broken hearts into love stories that last forever. And this, she knew with absolute certainty, was one of those stories.